Title of this lesson is Every Man Stood in His Place, which I don't often just mention the title, but that one really just sticks out to me. Every man stood in his place. And so kind of set the stage of where we left off in chapter 6. Gideon had come to this battlefield, delivered to this battlefield, surrounded with his own people, and several other tribes joined him. And he stood before the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the Goobers from the east, if you remember. And this was quite a gathering, and they already noted several times that this was a multitude of people, and they came. They were nomads, and they came with camels in numbers that were far beyond what could be counted. So you just imagine looking on this valley, and there's the map, and I don't know if you'll be able to see the map, but kind of up where the red line kind of curls around, that kind of curls around the Jezreel Valley, which we've talked about for several weeks in Judges. And on the base of one mountain to the south would have been where Gideon and his army are at the base of that mountain, and at the straight north of that would be where the Amalekites the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the men from the east are gathered together. So there's a face-off across this valley, the valley of Flor being sort of this battlefield. And what brought them to this battlefield? We got to go all the way back and remember it was apostasy. It was an apostate Israel that was worshiping other gods, that the Midianites that are now going to war against God's people, they were God's tool. God brought them. God brought them to punish and lead the Israelites back to him. They were the Midianites and the Amalekites, and these men from the east were the scourge that God used to bring correction to his people. So as they stood in this place, as these men stood in this place, facing this, what would begin to look like an impossible situation. But God brought him there, and God brought him there by promise, and then Gideon got his fleece confirmed twice, right? And so what we're going to see is God gave a promise, but that wasn't quite, a promise is nice, but for Gideon it was like, it wasn't quite enough. He needed to hang his fleece out a couple times just to make sure that promise, he really understood that promise. Now remember, he met the Lord at this tree, and then the Lord disappeared, and this conversation with the Lord continues on. Very cool. I don't know how that happened. I don't know how that played out exactly, but it's a very cool picture. I won't spill that tea. Not on a Christmas tree, that would be bad. I can see that happening, so I'll spill it over there instead. So now Gideon has his promise, and he has his confirmed with the Lord twice, and now he's standing there looking at, now listen to this. This is 135,000 people, it said. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and the Goobers from the east, 135,000. And there's 32,000 of them in Israel. Those numbers, you don't like those numbers if you're leading an army, right? That's very, very good. And so Gideon is looking at this, and the fear has to be welling up. This is a bad situation. But what brought him to that place? To stand in that place because they brought this upon themselves. And the only way out of this, and the only way that was ever to get out of it, or even just to avoid it, was to be faithful to the Lord, faithful and obedient. So man, we get churned through so much of life, and we go through so many different things, and they come back and go, the only way through this, or the only way to avoid this, is obedient and faithfulness to the Lord. That's it. And sometimes he wants us to go through seasons and difficult times, and he leads us right through those things and guides us and teaches us even to be faithful in those circumstances. And so I think that's what the Lord has brought them this place where they have to have faith in him, because this is looking rather impossible. So that sets the stage. So let's jump into chapter 7. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early, and they encamped beside the well of Harod. So the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Marah in the valley, and which as I described. And so the well of Harod, Harod is actually a word that means it means fear or trembling. It actually sort of means trembling. Now, they didn't just happen to camp by this well of trembling. It became the well of trembling because they camped there, right? They camped there, and it became known, and it was named because of what was going on there, that there was trembling and fear characterized this army, right? And who wouldn't be afraid? Who wouldn't have fear there? It's interesting that the chapter starts with the name of Jerubbaal. Remember, this is Gideon's other name that his father gave him. And it was a name that said that a reminder that Baal will deal with you. Because he had torn down the altar of Baal, they were going to go, the men of the town were going to go kill him, right? And instead of killing him, his father said, let Baal take care of himself. And he renamed his son the Baal, essentially saying Baal owes you one. Baal will take care of you. And so in one hand, every day that Gideon rises and sees another sunrise, it shows that Baal is powerless over his life, which is very cool. But for a man that's characterized by fear like Gideon is, and by timidness, it might be a constant reminder of fear. And so the same name can serve different purposes, which is kind of interesting. All the people, all 32,000 now camped. Looks like a lot of people. Looks like a lot of people showed up. This looks pretty impressive too, until you look across the valley and see 135,000 of those that want to kill you. Verse 2. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many. In which case Gideon said, huh? The Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, my own hand saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart. Depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. $22,000 said, yeah, not for me. I'm scared. Which is probably where right there is when somebody named this the well of trembling, right? And is this not the normal response of fear? Wouldn't that be the normal response? So what's the 10,000? Who are these 10,000? It's funny because many times you hear this passage taught. It's like God's paring it down to the SEAL team, man. He was getting the bad units ready, and he was getting all these other guys out of the way. And I think it's completely opposite. I think God is paring this down, and it's going to look like the bad news bears of armies when he's done. And so there's 10,000 remain. Now to me, this is the proud or the ignorant. They're too ignorant to know they ought to be scared, or they're too proud to let anybody see it. The proud and the ignorant, right? And I think that's probably speaks to all of us. Now, we see ourselves in this situation. You know, I'm 32,000 in the camp. I'm looking around and go, you know, there was the first guy, right? There was the first guy said, anybody that's fearful, you can go home. Everybody's looking around, and then one guy stood up, started leaving. 10 went with him, and 10 went with them, and suddenly there was a mass exodus. And what was left was, I believe, proud and ignorant. Let's go to Corinthians. You don't have to go there. I can read it to you. But it's 1 Corinthians 1:27. It's a familiar verse. I know that you know it. 1 Corinthians 1. I'll just start 26. For you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things which are despised God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are. And here's the key to it, that no flesh should glory in his presence. That God is setting the battlefield, and he's setting the terms of the battle, and he's going to make his battle on his terms so that he gets the glory, and no flesh, no man is going to stand at the end of this and say, yeah, I really did. I really showed, and it's because of me that we've won, or us in any way. And so, 10,000 people left. Gideon had to be looking at the 10,000 that were left and wondering if maybe if it would have been okay if he left with those that were fearful. It doesn't say, but I suspect that he was at least thinking, it was at least going through his mind. We can ask ourselves, where will your faith be? You have a promise from God, and you stand at the base of the mountain. Every man is standing in his place. Where's your place? Are you standing in that place of faith and belief in the promises of God? God is not looking for those that would poke out their chest with bravado and say, I can take on the devil in the name of Jesus Christ, but those that would just stand in faithfulness and let the Lord fight the battles and be a steward to what the Lord has given us in every way. It's a hard thing. Many times it's a hard thing. This would be a hard thing. The Lord uses those weak and the despised and the inadequate and the incompatible and so forth. And so probably of all of those people that left, there may have been a lot of them thinking, I wonder if God saw that coming. God wasn't wringing his hands going, ooh, I'll get 10,000 left. Well, we know he wasn't because we know how the story goes on, right? Verse 4, but the Lord said to Gideon, conversation continues, right? The Lord said to Gideon, the Lord is still speaking to him. Instead of shaking and quivering, looking at this, his eyes are seeing something that's impossible, and the Lord is still speaking to him. I think that's so cool. Sometimes we just got to listen. The Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. And again, I think, that's like, time out. What? You mean too many? You mean they're too many? No. 10,000 is just still too many. Lord, have you done the math? The Lord says, I'm expert at math. People are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, the same shall go with you, and whomever I say to you, this one shall not go with you, the same shall not go. And so he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who does not get, who gets down on his knees to drink. And a number of those who lapped, putting their hand in their mouth, was 300 men, and all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. And then the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lapped, I will save you, and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place. And so the Lord So the people took provisions and the trumpets in their hands, and he sent away all the rest of the Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. Which is interesting, note how they end that little passage, Lord takes him down and does this testing. Again, you probably heard many messages, and the popular one is the one that laps, he's got his eyes on the horizon, and he's the great soldier. But again, the Lord's not trying to find the good soldiers. This is just a method of dividing them, of paring them down. The Lord wasn't looking for the SEAL team. He wasn't looking for the great warriors. In fact, I think this 300 men, I do believe it probably did look like the Bad News Bears of armies. Imagine some short guy with a great big sword dragging it along behind him. Some other guy tripping over his shoelaces. And I mean, this is who we are. This is what it would look like, right? The Lord's not looking for those that to get someone that's already equipped and already right, and I'm going to pare it down, I'm going to find because they're hidden in the crowd. The Lord says, I'm going to take it, and it may look very random, but the Lord will equip and use as he sees fit in his way. And I think that's powerful for us to remember. And so God pares it down to 300. This is the math of fear, right? This is the math of fear. 135,000 to 300 now. And this is the math that you do in the dark of the night, the day before the battle. It goes through your head and says, there's no way. This is impossible. This can't be done. But this is the math that of fear that when you add God into that math, it's 300 plus God conquers anything. And so it's adding God into the equation by faith. And so this math of fear is what leads you to that idea of faith. And so that math can say, only God can pull this off, and God will get the glory when he does. Or that math can bring you to that place where you're just overwhelmed by fear. Fear just keeps coming up in this. Fear comes over and over and over into this story. Fear comes up. And they almost pause this whole story right here with this, the Lord declaring, now I can take these 300 and I'm going to do this with these 300, and I'm going to glorify myself. And then he said that he sent the others away, but they took their provisions, and so they took their trumpets. And so already it's like, okay, we've got 300 trumpets. Normally you wouldn't have but a few trumpets scattered among the hundreds, right? A few trumpets, and a few, if it was night, you'd only have like a few torches. One torch to light the battlefield for quite a few people. And so a torch and a trumpet would light for this, hundreds maybe. And so they're taking the provisions of these others, and the 300 are, and then they're sending them away. So the 300 have their provisions. And then it just pauses for a moment to tell you that the camp of Midian was below them in the valley. So just slightly below them, so they're kind of looking off to the north and just seeing 135,000. And camels beyond number. And what a crazy picture. As I said, fear is predominant in these passages, and how the Lord deals with the fear of his people, but also how he uses the fear of the enemy. And we see fear work in a couple different ways, and fear can be something that happens, it wells up in us over time, and it can be the product of really worrying and fretting, which some of us are very expert at, right? We can take this tiniest thing and we can worry it into this huge thing that snowballs into this mammoth barricade in our life that we will never find our way through. And we find the worst possible outcome, and then we dwell on that worst possible outcome. And really, when this worry and this fretting comes to a place where it begins to create this fear, then fear does this work in our mind. It's fascinating because I'm reading this book about our brain, which I find really fascinating. And it was talking about fear right in the middle of studying this lesson. Let me read this little passage. It says, when worry invades a person's mind, it can send the brain into a kind of spasm. It's like a lock that is unable to relax and accept anything that is good or positive. And all it sees is the negative, and it's not just a fleeting thought, but something that seems encased in cement. Have you ever had a muscle cramp and you can't get rid of it? One author describes it in this way. The mind of the worrier is an effort to anticipate danger, to stave off some bad outcome. And it has gone into this spasm, and it's a lock that can't relax it. It can't accept good news, and the mind cannot let go of the matter at hand. And it can't seem to see it in anything but a negative way. And hours and days and weeks and even years can be poisoned by the ruminating of a single fear, one predominating worry. I think probably everybody's found themselves in a similar circumstance at some point in time. That is just this trap, and our brain just gets programmed with this in time where we grab onto anything and we worry about it. I got a cough. Sorry. The other kind of fear, and there's probably lots of different other things. These two predominant is this instant fear, instant fear that causes a response, and this is the terror that shuts down our thinking and our reasoning part of our brain. So instant terror, when you're in that situation, it's like a switch has been flipped, the brain is shut off, all reasoning, all logic is shut down. It doesn't matter. Our ability to sort of analyze and go if, then, and what if, and all that stuff is gone. Our brain says one thing. It says either fight or run or freeze or fawn. And usually it's run or fight. You know, it's kind of the predominant ones is you go into fight mode or just turn and run because of this fear. You're not thinking about where to run to. You're not thinking about what happens if you're not thinking about anything. Your brain has taken over and it puts you in survival mode. It doesn't even matter if it's a real fear. If your brain perceives it as a fear, it's very real to the brain, and the brain takes over. And this is what we see over and over. Doesn't, all brave words. So if you're one of these 300 now, like I was okay with part being one of 10,000, but I'm just one of 300 now. And you're looking at the 135,000. You better have a little faith in God or something. But really, all the brave words, well, I'll show them, and I'm going to die a warrior, whatever the, courageous talk might be, right? All the brave words, the courageous talk, best intentions, none of that will stave off that horrifying fear. All the shame and the mockery, any of that stuff, that doesn't change the way a person is programmed, the fear that is programmed in them. When the brain is overwhelmed, it responds and it takes over and it's in charge. And really what you see is the only thing that can alter this response is, for Christian, is that renewed mind. And you can go through years of therapy and possibly change your programming, but that stuff's programmed in. But God can renew your mind and teach you faith responses and teach your mind a new thing. And God can overrule and rule supreme, maybe is a better way of saying that, than the brain and self ruling supreme. And so we can give that stuff over to the Lord in that response. And particularly when you're looking at this situation, you know that there is a fear that is coming. If it isn't already set in, you sort of have this chance to really let it churn and worry and work on you for time if you were standing in this difficult place. But there's the horrifying fear of being in the midst of the battlefield that is coming and the preparation for that. Let's go on, verse 9. It happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand." And again, we see that the Lord continues to talk to him. And he says, it's time to rise, it's time to go. And the Lord would do this battle. But he throws in the buddy up, verse 10. But if you are afraid to go down, the Lord anticipated that. Go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say. And afterward your hands will be strengthened to go down against the camp. And then he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. Now the Midianites and Amalekites and all the people of the east were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts. You can picture that. You ever seen locusts? You can't count them. It just covers everything. It just changes the color of the earth. Numerous as locusts, their camels were without number as the sand by the seashore in the multitude. And so they go down. Now, to me, this is crazy. It's bad enough standing and looking. Now you're going to go down in the midst of them. But if you're afraid to go down and do as the Lord had said, the Lord says, just go down into the camp and listen. It's interesting because there's another situation in the Bible that's very similar. This is in 1 Samuel 14:6, when Jonathan says, then Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised," talking about Philistines. "It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few." Now, that's a whole different outlook from Jonathan than Gideon has, right? And Jonathan goes over and says, let's see what the Lord's got. Let's see what he's going to have us do. This is going to be a great adventure. Come on, man. The armor bearer's like, dude, are you crazy? And it doesn't say Purah is Gideon's armor bearer. How would you like to be an armor bearer with a guy that has no courage and no faith and to be walking alongside him going, oh, Lord, you'd be praying for him, I guess, Gideon had, verse 13, and when Gideon had come, there was a man telling the dream. So they make their way down towards the Midianites. And when Gideon had got there, listening into the camp, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. And he said, I have had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent, and it struck it so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed. And then his companion answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered the Midian and the whole camp. Now, this is fascinating. Now, I'm going to stop again for a moment and kind of reset things. Remember, Gideon was, at the beginning of this, God says, I'm going to do a work in your life, mighty man of valor. Remember that? And Gideon was looking around going, who's the mighty man of valor? And then God begins to work in his life, and he has no faith. He says, God has left us. And he had a complaint that God had done something. He forgot that he had an altar of Baal and Ashtoreth in his own backyard. And it's like God said, let's start with that. And so he begins this work in Gideon's life to bring him to this place where he's going to use him to deliver. In this, you see Gideon rise up in fear. he has this Moses sort of response. He says, I want somebody to deliver Israel. I just don't want it to be me. And God says, no, it's you. And he brings this work, and he starts down this path. And then Gideon has to have these fleeces to reinforce his promise. And then Gideon's feeling a little bit better. Now he's got his fleeces. And then God takes all that confidence that he has, and he pares that army down to 300. Whatever confidence he had for those fleeces is gone. And now he's too afraid to go down as he was told. And God says, go down there. And God doesn't shore him up. He doesn't build his, but he gives him the same promise he started with. Gideon believes in a Amalekite dream when he didn't believe God in the first time. He sort of believed God, I guess. But he believes when the Amalekite dream confirms this. Which is kind of interesting. God uses this enemy, which God was using this sort of what would be essentially a godless group of people that God used to judge his own people. But he used these Midianites to do his work. So he sets this all up where Gideon shows up at the right time where this man is telling this dream. Dreams were important to them. Dreams were important in those days, but and they would call a dream interpreter to interpret the dreams. But it was like, this is so obvious you don't need a dream interpreter. And he says this is obviously nothing but the sword of Gideon. So somewhere in this, God has inserted this reputation of Gideon of being a great warrior. Suddenly they have a fear of Gideon. Oh, this is nothing other than the sword of Gideon, and God is going to give over the Midianites into Gideon. And so he's instilling this fear because they understand that God, the math of fear, they understand that God plus the Gideon and the Israelites could wipe out the Midianites. They understood that. So I think God possibly put this in the rumor mill too. I think he was managing their rumor mill that suddenly this dream is going around that, hey, did you hear that this dream? And you know how rumor mills can be. And God's using the rumor mill and filling it up with Gideon's reputation and this dream that they could be conquered by Gideon. Now suddenly they go out to the battlefield and they're filled with fear themselves. And God's about to do his work. And so it was, verse 15, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, that he worshiped. He believed the promise. He believed God. He found his faith. He found a godly courage to do what God called him to do. He returned to the camp and he said, arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. This arise is the exact same word from verse 9 when the Lord first said arise. The Lord would have his way, and he took the scenic route back to that same place where he said, let's arise because the Lord is going to deliver the Midians into your hand. Verse 16. Then he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put a trumpet into every man's hand with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. Watch. And when I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. Man, he just looks like a different person now. He just looks like a different person. And he's saying, do what I do. He's not saying, I'll be back here, you guys go do this. He is leading and leading by example. He says, verse 18, when I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the whole camp and say, the sword of Gideon, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Which is kind of interesting because the dream was that the Lord was doing this work, but that Gideon, it was the sword of Gideon that they feared. But Gideon gives the glory to the Lord by saying, this is the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Gideon's part would be as the Lord determined. Verse 19. The battle was on. 300 against 135,000. Epic battle, right? Everybody looks at that and says, well, this ought to be quick. Verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outpost of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just as they had posted the watch. And so as the watch is changing, this would have been in the middle of the night, the watch is changing. Somebody was coming off of essentially watch, off of guard duty. They would have been tired. Their job is done, and they're not really paying attention. The incoming would not be settled in yet. Things are a little bit chaotic. This is when they come to the edge of the camp. And so Gideon's got his 100. The other two sides are 100 on each side that are scattered out. And he blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers that were in their hands. Notice they have a trumpet in one hand and they have a pitcher with a torch in the other. They didn't say anything about no swords or nothing. They had no weapons. This was their weapon. Was their faith and their obedience into what God had asked them to do. The torches would have been in the jars, would have probably just been smoldering, having burned up the air, and be just a smoldering torch. And when the charge would break, oxygen would just light them up, and suddenly there would be a light. As he said, a trumpet usually was blown for a large army. If there were 300 trumpets, the implication was, oh my gosh, run for the hills. If there were suddenly lights, a light would have been a single light for the many that had the sword. Nobody would think that 300 guys had come in there with a trumpet and a torch, not having an army of thousands of swords behind them, right? They blew the trumpets, broke the pitchers that were in their hands. Verse 20, then the three companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers. And they held torches in their left hand and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing. And they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And there it is, verse 21. And every man stood in his place all around the camp. So kind of freeze this moment. You're holding a torch and a trumpet. I wonder how hard it is to blow the trumpet when you're quivering in fear. Some things aren't easy to blow. And 135 people with swords are standing before you. And every man stood in his place all around the camp. And everyone had a place of these 300 as they surrounded these. And they stood with their torch and the trumpet, blew the trumpet, said the sword of Gideon and the sword of the Lord, sword of Gideon. Man, there had to be a moment there where I just had a lump in his throat. Now what? What's next? And the whole army ran and cried out and fled. The phrase itself kind of tells me that dream must have been in the rumor mill. That the Lord had struck fear in them, that he'd given Gideon a reputation. The idea that Gideon was here and they're attacking was more than they could handle. Combination of that fear that God used their fear against them, and that fear that was working on them, he lit up with these torches and with this phrase and the trumpet blast. And the whole army ran and they cried out and they fled. Verse 22, and when the 300 blew the trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his companion throughout the whole camp. And the army fled to Beth Acacia toward Zerah. as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabith. It's kind of a yellow line shown on the map. If you can see that, I know it's not real visible. If you want a copy of that map, I'd be glad to mail it to you. Pardon me. This army begins to swing a sword at anything that's moving. Struck with fear, and suddenly an army against an army becomes every man for himself. And everyone is set to their own survival mode, and their fight or flight response kicks in, and they are fighting their way out as they are running. And this army essentially kills itself. Verse 23, and the men of Israel gathered together from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, and pursued the Midianites. So this was the previous army, those of the other tribes that had showed up to help Gideon that were first paired away. They're now in pursuit of the remaining army. Verse 24, then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites, and seized from them the watering places as far as Bethbara and the Jordan. Then the men of Ephraim gathered together and seized the watering places as far as Bethbara and Jordan. And they captured the two princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb. I love those names, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb on the rock of Oreb, and Zeb was killed at the winepress of Zeb. And they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan. This kind of marks the end of the Midianite army, although the story will continue on into chapter 8. It's interesting to note once the Midianites began to slaughter themselves, the army just dissolved. They were running that we really don't see the Lord involved in this. We don't see the Lord telling them to chase him. We see Gideon and the others joining in. We also see Gideon then sending to the Ephraimites and head them off at the pass, which the Ephraimites go to the Jordan, and they intercept them, and that's where they conquer these two princes. And they kill them on the rock of Oreb and at the winepress of Zeb. Again, these rock and this winepress are interesting bookend to the story, right? Because Gideon's story started at a rock in a winepress, if you remember. He was hiding at the winepress, threshing wheat in the winepress so that the Midianites would not see him. And in his own backyard was the temple, or the altar to Baal, and which would have had the foundation stone that was later used for an altar to burn a sacrifice, a burnt offering to the Lord. And so Gideon was called from the winepress and from this altar to the Lord on this stone, and you sort of bookend this story with it ending with these princes being slaughtered at this rock and at this winepress. And their heads are brought to Gideon. It's kind of gross. Be like, ooh, I don't need that. Thank you very much, though. But that was a common thing, right? Just get a couple more comments, and then we'll close this out. Really, the bookend of this stone in this winepress shows that there's no more hiding from the Midianites. But more importantly, the whole purpose of all of this was to drive them back to faithfulness and obedience to the Lord. to drive them away from their apostasy and drive them to repentance, so once again that they would look and have faith to the Lord. And so the whole thing was to reestablish a community of faith and to restore them in the presence of the Lord as they had been and as they should be. And we see that they, this apostate ways in a nation, you can see that how it plays out where they struggle to overcome any of those fears and to be faithful when the Lord has given his promise. And we can relate to that, right? Can we not? We have lots of amazing promises in the scriptures, and that the Lord will never leave us or forsake us, that he's always with us. And yet we struggle with fear, we struggle with being timid, we struggle with feeling inadequate, and on it goes, right? And nobody's nodding, so maybe it's just me. No. 2 Corinthians 12 says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And so as we are weak, he is strong. And it's okay to be weak. And let him be strong for us and in our place. And it's like just letting our daddy take care of us and staying in his shadow and let him do the heavy work, right? Let him do all the work. Our own pride and our fears must be broken. And our understanding and ways must yield to the Lord in obedience, and the Lord can do a mighty work through us and with us. And in Christ we carry that light, we carry that hope, and we have a far greater weapon than any weapon of the world. There's many times where we look at what's going on in the world, and it'd feel like this 300 against 135,000. But the Bible is very clear that we don't war against an unbelieving or apostate world. That we war against principalities, powers. That our war is against evil. Our war is not against those folks who are not our enemies. In fact, they represent what you would be without Jesus Christ in your life. They represent what I would be without Christ in my life. And in many cases, we can look at an unbelieving world that looks like that great multitude across the valley that it wants to make war with us. And we could say, yeah, that was me not that long ago. That was my camp. That was my beliefs. And now we walk with the Lord. And so our desire is to reach that lost and dying world, not to conquer and overcome them, but to overcome and conquer the real enemy, and that's who we make war with. And we do that by our faithfulness. You know that fear comes from the enemy's camp. It does not come from the Lord. Let's bow our heads.